She arrived at his ranch with one wooden box and a rule he wasn't allowed to break. "Don't open it," she told him, and a man who'd lost his barn and half his cattle didn't have the fight left to argue. But the box sat in his kitchen through 3 weeks of failing harvest and a bankman counting down his last days, and a man can only leave a locked thing alone for so long. When he finally broke his word and lifted the lid, what he found inside didn't just explain her. It rebuilt everything he'd lost. Stay until the end to see what was in the box, and if it moves you, hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The supply wagon left her at the end of a rutted track that wound through dead grass and dust for a 1/4 mile before it reached the Wade place. The driver didn't help her down, and she hadn't asked him to. She stood in the road with one lacquered box the color of dark tea, tied shut with a cord wound 3 times, and nodded, and she watched the wagon go with the patience of someone who had already been left in worse places than this. Later, when Tucker came to town for nails, the driver told him she hadn't said 10 words the whole ride, and hadn't let the box out of her lap once, not even to eat, and that he'd been glad to be rid of her because quiet women made him nervous. Tucker Wade came off the porch with his hat in his hand and the sun behind him. He put an ad in a California paper 4 months back, asking for a wife who could work alongside a man and not just keep house, and he'd half hoped no one would answer. A man who advertised for a wife at 34 had already admitted something he couldn't take back, and he'd spent the months since the ad ran trying to pretend he hadn't admitted it. He'd expected someone weathered and plain and tired, in the same ways he was tired. A woman who'd understand a broken ranch because she'd come from one. Instead, he found a small woman in a dust-coated trail coat worn over a faded kimono, the color of dry leaves, her jet black hair pulled back tight, her face all sharp angles, and high cheekbones and eyes so dark they looked black in the shadow of the doorframe. She didn't smile or flinch, just looked past him at the collapsed barn and the open corral and the cattle standing in dirt, and her face didn't change. And that was the first thing about her that unsettled him. The barn had been gone 3 weeks. A windstorm out of the north had taken the whole south wall and dropped the roof across the corral fence in a heap of splintered timber and twisted iron. He'd been pulling it apart 1 board at a time ever since, with a bad shoulder and a crosscut saw with 3 teeth missing. The cattle stood in the open with no shelter, and he'd already lost 2 calves to the wet and the cold, and the rest were going thin on grass that had given up early that year. A banknote came due in 6 weeks. Winter sat 8 weeks out, and the sky over the ridge had already started to turn the color of cold iron. He was broke, and he was alone, and he was too proud to say either one out loud to a woman he'd married through the mail. She carried the box inside herself, didn't wait for him to take it, and didn't ask where to put it. She set it down inside the kitchen doorway, not in the bedroom, and that small choice told him more about her than anything she'd said so far. Then she turned and looked at him, and she told him the one thing she asked, which was not to open the box, not now, not later, not ever. She said it the way a person says a vow, not the way a person makes a request, and the difference between those 2 things was something Tucker felt before he could have named it. He agreed, because he was tired, and she had said it like a thing that mattered more than the roof over her head, and he didn't have the strength left to fight a woman who looked like she'd already survived worse than anything he could threaten her with. He tried to ask where she'd come from, why him, why a ranch at the edge of nowhere. She answered in short, careful English, each word placed like a stone in a wall. Her husband had died. She'd had to leave. That was all she gave him, and her face said the door was closed. That first night she cooked from what he had, which wasn't much, and made a soup from dried fish she had carried in her satchel and roots she found behind the well house before the light went. He ate it, and it was good, and he didn't say so. She ate hers in small, slow bites, the way a person eats who has learned that a meal can be taken away. He watched her across the table and felt something he couldn't name. Not pity, because pity would have insulted her. something closer to the feeling of seeing a thin animal stand in a field and knowing the winter was coming for it. He lay in the front room that night and listened to her move through the kitchen, quiet as snow, and he thought about the box, sitting 3 feet from where she slept with one hand resting on the cord. He didn't know yet that the box would eat at him harder than the barn, or the bank, or the winter, or what it would cost him to leave it shut. He would find out. The days fell into a rhythm that Tucker hadn't asked for and couldn't fault. Ray ran the house the way she'd run something larger, once with a quiet efficiency that left no task undone and no word wasted. She cooked from what he had and made it stretch further than he'd thought it could, and she walked the land in the early mornings, before he was up, coming back with herbs and roots he'd never noticed in 20 years of walking the same ground. His shirts she mended with stitches so small, and even they looked like they'd grown there, and she worked without being asked, and spoke only when spoken to, and she ate her meals in small, careful bites, like someone who'd learned that food could be pulled out from under a person. Caught himself watching the box. It sat on the shelf by the stove where she'd first set it, and she passed it 100 times a day without touching it, and that was somehow worse than if she'd held it. One morning he moved it to sweep under the shelf, and she went still in a way that stopped his hand before he'd set it back down. She didn't raise her voice or repeat herself, just stood in the doorway and watched him, and the silence had a weight to it that made him set the box down and step back and find something to do in the yard. That stillness was worse than any argument he'd ever had with a woman, because an argument was at least a door a man could walk through, and her silence was a wall. He threw himself at the barn, because the barn was the one thing he understood. He was one man with a bad shoulder and a saw that fought him on every stroke, and the work went slow and mean. The banknote sat in the back of his head like a stone. He rose before light and worked until dark. The frame he managed to raise was crooked and wouldn't hold the weight of a roof, and he knew it, and he kept going anyway, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant admitting that one man and a bad shoulder couldn't save this ranch alone. On the 9th day a beam slipped off the sawhorse and caught his forearm on the way down. The cut was deep, down to the pale grain of the muscle, and the blood came fast and dark. He walked inside, holding his arm closed with his other hand, and he didn't say anything, 'cause there wasn't anything to say. He'd been hurt worse, and he'd lived, and the living had always been the part that surprised him. Rye took one look and moved, didn't ask permission, just sat him in the chair by the stove, and tore a clean strip from a sheet. From a lacquered case she kept in her satchel, she drew a set of needles so fine they caught no light, and a pouch of herbs she had somehow found on his land in 9 days of walking it. She cleaned the wound with water she boiled, packed it with a paste that smelled of green and earth, and closed the skin with stitches smaller than the one she'd put in his shirt. The whole time her hands were steady and her face was calm, the kind of calm that only comes from having done the hard thing enough times that the hard thing has stopped being hard. He watched her work and didn't understand what he was seeing, only that the wound closed clean where it should have festered and cost him the arm, in a place this far from a doctor. He asked her that night, quiet, where she'd learned to do that. She said her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother before that, and that a woman in her family learned to mend a body before she learned to mend a coat, because the body was the thing that couldn't be replaced. He asked her again about the box, and she said only that it had been her husband's. Then, for the first time since she'd arrived, she begged, not loud and not with tears, just a low, flat please that came out of her like something pulled from a deep well. It cost her something he could feel in the room, the way a man feels a change in the weather before he sees it. He backed off and told her he wouldn't open it, and he meant it, and the not knowing started to eat at him that same night and didn't stop. A woman trained to heal and to keep her mouth shut was guarding one box above everything else she owned, and he couldn't figure out why. The question started to sit in him right next to the banknote and the barn, and it grew in the dark the way questions grow when a man can't answer them. Hollis Crane rode in on a Tuesday with the sun high and his hat pulled low. He held Tucker's banknote, due in 5 weeks, and he was the kind of man who measured a rancher's worth by what he could take from him when the note came due. He'd done it twice before in the county, taken 2 ranches off 2 men who'd been one bad season from the edge, and he carried that history in the set of his shoulders the way a gunfighter carries a reputation. He didn't need to threaten most men, because most men threatened themselves the moment they saw him ride up, already knowing the math better than he did. He saw Ray on the porch before he saw Tucker, and his face changed. He pulled his horse up short and sat there a second too long, taking her in, the dark hair and the foreign coat and the quiet way she stood with her hands at her sides and her back straight. He smiled the way a man smiles when he's found something he hadn't expected to want, and he tipped his hat to her and called her a pretty piece of cargo, and the word cargo landed in the yard like a stone dropped in still water. He made his threat quiet and dressed it up as a joke, the way men like him always do. He said a man who couldn't keep a roof over his cattle probably couldn't keep one over a wife either, and he reached toward her face casual, the way a man tests a horse's teeth at auction. His fingers got within a hand's width of her jaw, and Ray didn't move, and that was the thing that made it worse, because a woman who flinches at least gives a man the satisfaction of having scared her, and she gave him nothing. Tucker stepped between them without thinking, his body moving before his head. Caught up, he put himself across the porch with his chest facing Crane and his back to her, and he said 3 words that he hadn't planned and couldn't take back. "She's my wife." It was the second lie of his life, and the first one that cost him nothing to mean, and the meaning of it surprised him even as the words left his mouth. Crane pulled his hand back and looked at Tucker for a long second, and the smile thinned but didn't break. He said the note was still due on the 1st, frost-born or no barn, and if the cattle weren't under roof by then, he'd take the land and everything standing on it. He looked past Tucker at Ray one more time as he said it, and what he meant by everything was clear enough to anyone who'd been on the frontier long enough to know how a man like that counted his winnings. Then he climbed on his horse and rode out the way he'd come, and the dust hung in the air behind him like a judgment. Tucker stood on the porch until the sound of the horse was gone. Ree came and stood beside him, not close, but there, the way a post stands, beside a wall it's been joined to. She didn't thank him, just said he shouldn't have claimed what wasn't true. He said it was true enough for Crane, and that was the kind of true the territory ran on. She looked at him for a long moment, and something passed between them, the kind of thing that doesn't have a name yet. Not love, and not even trust, but a recognition. 2 people who'd both learned what it meant to stand alone against something bigger than them, seeing each other clearly for the first time across a porch in the dust. The clock had started for real now. 5 weeks, a barn, a roof, and a man who'd take it all if they missed. And Tucker went to bed that night with the number 5 sitting in his chest like a nail he couldn't pull out. 3 weeks in, and the barn was barely a frame, and the frame was wrong. Tucker drove himself at it every daylight hour, and the work fought him back, the timber splitting where he cut it, the joints gaping where he tried to seat them, the whole thing leaning like a drunk against the wind. He was failing, and he knew it, and the knowing sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow. He'd figured the math 100 ways, and the math always came out the same, which was that one man with a bad shoulder couldn't raise a roof in 2 weeks, and the 2 weeks was all the sky was giving him. Ray worked beside him now. She'd started the 2nd week, hauling timber off the pile and handing it up to him on the frame without being asked, and he'd let her because he was out of pride. She was tireless, and she was quiet, and she moved the wood like she knew its weight before she lifted it, like she could feel the grain through her palms. But she wouldn't explain how she knew to read the grain of a beam, or why she'd eye a joint the way a hunter eyes a kill, or where a woman who'd been a wife in a town across the sea had learned to move timber like a man raised on it. He asked once, and she said only that she had watched, and the door closed again, and he let it close because he was too tired to push it. A frost warning came down off the ridge on a Sunday morning, the sky going pale and hard, the kind of sky that meant 2 weeks, and then the cold would hit and stay. 2 weeks was all he had, and Tucker stood in the frame. He couldn't finish, and did the math, and the math didn't work, and this time there was no other math to try. One man with a bad shoulder and a woman who wouldn't explain herself couldn't raise a roof in 2 weeks, and if they couldn't, Crane took the land, and her along with it, in his eyes. Ree rode out at first light to barter eggs and dried herbs at the trading post for nails and flour he couldn't pay for. She took the butt-board, the work wagon, not a carriage, because a carriage was a frail thing for passengers, and a butt-board was the only vehicle on the place that could haul a load back. She left before he was awake, and she left the box. For the first time in 3 weeks, she left the box unguarded. The box rested on the shelf by the stove, where it had been since the first day, the cord still wound 3 times, the knot still tight. The kitchen was empty, and the door was open, and the frost was coming, and the banknote was coming, and the not knowing was coming, all of it at once, like 3 rivers joining at the same bend. He didn't know yet that the thing inside would cost him more than the barn ever had, or that the cost was the whole point of it. Tucker fought it for an hour. He swept the floor, sharpened the saw, ate a piece of bread standing up, and walked past the shelf 4 times, and didn't look, and looked anyway. The box sat there the whole time, and it pulled at him the way a bad tooth pulls at the tongue, and every minute he left it shut, the pull got worse. A man can only leave a locked thing alone for so long, and Tucker had reached the end of so long. The frost and the deadline and the not knowing all came together in his chest, and he crossed the kitchen and lifted the lid. Inside, nested in oiled cloth, the color of old snow, were tools. A set of chisels, forged thin and bright, their handles worn smooth and dark by another man's grip. The steel so fine it held an edge a man could feel before he touched it. Beside them lay a hand plane, short and dark, made to be pulled toward the body instead of pushed, the kind that shaves a curl of wood so thin a man can see light through it. Next to it sat a pull saw with a blade so fine it whispered when he touched it, cutting on the pull instead of the push. There was an ink-line pot, lacquered black, with a line still wound around its reel, and a wad of cotton still soaked in the old ink, and a small gimlet for boring holes. Each one was worn into the shape of a hand that wasn't his, and the wear was what made him go still, because wear like that takes years, and years meant a man had lived and worked and died holding these, and that man was not Tucker. Beneath the tools, a roll of paper tied with a thin cord. He unrolled it on the kitchen floor, and the ink lines on it were so precise they looked printed, each one snapped straight and true. It was a plan for his barn, every beam and post and joint drawn to the fraction, in a way of building he'd never seen. There were no nails and no iron, only cuts that interlocked and wedges that locked them tight, the timbers fitting together like fingers laced, the whole frame holding itself up by the shape of the wood alone. He could see the dovetail seats where the beams would meet, and the long scarf joints that would let him join short timbers into long ones, and a way to splice the rotted posts he'd thought he'd have to cut down and throw away. He sat on the kitchen floor with the tools in his lap, and the plan unrolled across the boards, and 2 things hit him at the same time, and the second one was worse. She hadn't come to be kept. She had come to build, and the box wasn't a secret she was hiding. It was a dead man's hands, the only thing she had left of him, and she had begged Tucker not to touch them, and he had promised. He had broken it anyway because the frost was coming and the math didn't work and the box had been sitting there for 3 weeks calling to him. He put the tools back, wound the cord, and set the box on the shelf exactly where it had been, a 1/4 inch off from where she'd left it. He knew as he did it that she would know, because a woman who noticed the grain of a beam would notice a box moved a 1/4 inch, and the lie was already dead before he told it. Ree came home in the late afternoon with the buckboard loaded and the light going long across the yard. She stopped in the kitchen doorway, the way she'd stopped the first day, and she didn't move, and Tucker knew she knew before she said a word. The box sat a quarter-inch off from where she'd left it, and she didn't need to open it because she could read that the way she read the grain of a beam. Her face, which had stayed steady through a storm and a wound and a man reaching for her jaw, went to a place he hadn't seen before. She didn't scream or weep, just stood in the doorway, and the silence between them was the worst sound he'd ever heard, worse than the wind taking the barn, worse than the beam hitting his arm. This silence at a person inside it who had trusted him with the one thing she'd asked, and he'd taken it back. He had promised, and he had broken it, and she had begged him not to, and a woman who never begs had begged him about this one thing, and he had done it anyway. Tucker told her the truth. He told her about the frost warning and the deadline and the hour he'd fought it, and he told her he'd opened the box anyway, and he didn't make an excuse. He could have said the bank man was coming, or the cattle would die, or a man can only leave a locked thing alone for so long, but he said none of it. He'd broken his word to a woman who never asked for anything, and the only thing left was to stand in it and let the cost land where it landed. She told him then what the box was. Her husband had been a carpenter in their town, not a common one, the kind who built the wooden shrines that stood in their valley. They were the kind that lasted centuries because they were made to flex and hold instead of crack, joined without a single nail, the wood cut so true, the joints held by their own shape. The tools had been his and his father's before him, forged by men who'd once made swords and turned that steel to edges fine enough to cut a hair lengthwise. When her husband died, she had nothing left of him but his hands in a box and the years she'd spent watching him work. He'd learned the joints the way a child learns a language, by being around them until they were inside her, until her hands knew what to do before her head told them. She'd answered Tucker's ad because it asked for a woman who could work, not just keep house, and working with wood was the one thing she knew she could do. She'd begged him not to open the box, because she'd wanted to prove herself with the work before she showed the tools, because the box was her worth held in her own hands, shown to herself before anyone else. Being seen before a person has earned it was the one thing he had taught her never to allow, because a joint either holds or it doesn't, he'd told her, and no one cares what the carpenter looked like while he cut it. She had wanted Tucker to see the barn before he saw the box, and now he'd seen the box first, and the order of things was broken along with the vow. Now, she had to decide something she'd thought she'd have months to decide, which was whether a man who'd break his word over a box could be trusted with a barn. With her and with the dead man's hands she'd carried across an ocean to keep safe. Tucker didn't move, just let the question sit in the room between them, because the answer wasn't his to give. He'd done the thing, and now the cost of it was hers to name, and he would stand in the kitchen and take whatever she named, and he would not make it easier for either of them by speaking first. The quiet ran long. The light moved across the kitchen floor and climbed the wall the way light does when no one is watching it, and still neither of them spoke. He understood then that this was the real test, not the barn and not the bank man, but whether two people who had each broken something the other valued could stand in a room long enough to let the breaking become a joint instead of a split. A joint holds, because the cut faces meet true, and the wood is willing to be held, and he didn't know yet if the wood was willing, he only knew he was. She crossed the kitchen and picked up the box, and she held it against her chest the way she'd held it in the wagon, and she looked at him, and the word she said was, tomorrow. She meant the barn, and she meant they would start at first light, and she meant the question of whether she stayed had been answered, not with a yes but with a chisel picked up at dawn, and that was the only kind of yes she knew how to give. She picked up the chisel at first light. He saw her do it through the window, and his chest unlocked something he hadn't known was locked. She came out with the incline pot and the plan rolled under her arm, and she didn't say anything about forgiveness because forgiveness wasn't the word for what was happening between them. She walked to the frame he'd built wrong and looked at it the way a doctor looks at a wound. And then she looked at him, and she said they would take it down and start over, and the way she said it made it clear this wasn't a request. They started at the first beam. Ray set the ink line and snapped it across the wood, and the chalk sang a single clear note that hung in the cold air. She cut to the line with the pull saw, and the blade went through the timber like it was cutting silk, and Tucker watched her hands and saw for the first time that what she did was the same thing he did, only taken to a place he hadn't known existed. He already built with mortise and tenon and wooden pegs, the frontier way, because nails cost money and the land was a long way from a forge. Her joints were that same idea, refined until the wood locked itself and didn't need the peg. She cut a dovetail seat in the end of a beam and showed him how the next piece slid into it and held, the tapered shape gripping tighter the more weight a man put on it, and he understood it in his hands before he understood it in his head. Then she showed him a scarf joint, the way to cut two short timbers so they lapped and locked and became one long beam, and he saw how he could use the short wood he had instead of the long wood he couldn't afford. He hadn't expected that, hadn't expected a woman half his size to teach him the one thing he thought he knew, and the not having expected it was the thing that changed how he saw her. They worked through the days. She taught without lecturing, showing a cut, handing him the tool, watching him do it once and then moving on, and he learned without saying he was learning, because saying it would have been another kind of pride he couldn't afford. The barn rose, frame first, each joint seated dry, no iron anywhere, the timbers interlocking until the whole thing stood by the shape of the wood and nothing else. It was the kind of frame that flexed in a wind instead of fighting it, the kind that held because it was built to give. Tucker ran his hand along the joints at the end of each day, and felt them tight and clean and true, and he knew in his hands that this barn would outlast him. There was a day in the middle of it when the work slowed and the light went soft and they sat on the frame to eat bread and drink water. She told him a small thing about her husband, not the wound of it, but a memory, the way the man would test a joint by holding it to his ear and tapping it, because a good joint rang clear and a bad one rang dull. Tucker tried it on the next beam he cut, holding the wood to the side of his head and knocking it with a knuckle, and the sound that came back was clear and high and true. He looked at her, and she almost smiled, and that was the first time he'd seen her face do that, and he kept the memory of it the way a man keeps a coin he found in the dirt. A storm came out of the north on the 5th day, hard and early, while the roof beams were still loose on the top of the frame. The sky went the color of a bruise, and the wind came in gusts that shook the half-raised frame, and Tucker felt the old fear hit him, the same fear he'd had the day the first barn came down. They lashed it down in the dark, Ray climbing the frame barefoot in the rain with the rope over her shoulder, Tucker holding the lines from the ground. And the rain came sideways, and the wind screamed, and he kept waiting for the joint he'd cut to fail. The frame held and not one joint slipped. The wood flexed in the wind and settled back and flexed again, and the joinery did the thing nails couldn't do, which was move with the storm instead of breaking against it. When the rain stopped and the dark thinned, they stood in the mud and looked up at a frame that was still standing, and Ray's hand found his arm for a second, and then let go, and that was all, and that was enough. That night, dry at last, she made tea from a small pot she'd carried the whole time in her satchel, the one thing she'd kept for herself. She poured him a cup, and he drank it, and it was bitter and green and good, and he didn't say so. They sat by the stove, and the silence between them was a different kind. Now not the silence of two strangers, and not the silence of a broken vow. It was the silence of two people who had built something together in the rain and were too tired to dress it up in words, and the word for it was recognition. The last beam seated at dawn on the day of the first frost, and the barn stood. Not the rough box Tucker would have built alone, the kind that leans and leaks and lasts 10 years if the weather is kind. This was a frame of interlocking timber that looked like it had grown there, tight and clean, the wood fitting so close the joints were nearly invisible, the frame held up by the shape of the cuts and the weight of the wood and nothing else. The cattle walked in under the new roof and stood quiet in the dry, and Tucker watched them settle and felt something in his chest let go that had been holding for weeks. Hollis Crane rode in at noon with 2 men and an empty wagon, expecting a ruined ranch and a foreclosed note and a woman he could take home like furniture. He found the barn full and the cattle under roof and the hay stacked, dry against the back wall. He climbed down off his horse and walked the frame, running his hand along a joint where 2 beams met with no nail and no peg, and his face went through 3 changes in the space of 10 seconds. He asked who built it, and Tucker said his wife. Crane laughed, the kind of laugh a man uses to cover the ground moving under his feet, and he laughed until he saw that no one in the yard was laughing with him, and then he stopped. The note was paid in labor and timber, way the territory worked when a man had no cash and a bank man wanted to look like he'd been fair, and Crane had no claim left. The barn stood, the cattle were under roof, the frost had come, and the stock would live through it. He climbed back on his horse and left the way he came, and this time the dust settled behind him and stayed settled, and Tucker watched him go and felt nothing, which was the best thing he'd felt in a month. Ree stood in the barn doorway after he was gone, the same doorway she'd stood in the first day when she'd looked at the wreck of the place, and her face hadn't changed. She ran her hand along the joint where the main beam met the post, the one she'd seated dry, with Tucker holding the line, locked tight without iron, built to flex and hold for longer than either of them would be alive to see. She didn't say she forgave him, just let the joint say it. The wood that held because 2 people had cut it to fit and then trusted it to the wind. And the trust was the kind that gets built, not the kind that gets spoken. Tucker thought about the box he'd opened and the word he'd broken, and how a man could do the wrong thing and still end up standing in the right place, and he didn't know if that made it right or just made it done. He supposed he'd spend the rest of his life not knowing, and he supposed that was the cost of having opened a thing he'd been asked to leave shut. Some cost a man pays once, and some he pays in small amounts for a long time, and this one felt like the second kind, and he found he didn't mind, because the barn was standing and she was still here, and the small cost was a price he could carry. He asked her quiet whether she'd stay. She looked at the frame, and then she looked at him, and she said the box was still in the kitchen. Then she said she'd need a second box now for her own tools, not his, because the hands in the first box had taught her hands, and her hands had built a barn, and her hands were done being a widow's hands, kept shut in the dark. The second box sat on the shelf beside the first one, empty, the lid off, waiting to be filled. 2 boxes on a kitchen shelf in a ranch house at the edge of the territory, one holding a dead man's hands and one holding nothing yet, and the barn out the window standing without a nail. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels.